The sun had barely risen over the sprawling expanse of the ranch, casting a muted golden glow over the dusty fields, when Thomas McAllister felt the crushing weight of loss settle upon him. The wide-open land that had once been his solace now felt unbearably empty. Only days ago, he had been full of hope, eagerly awaiting the birth of his first child with his beloved wife, Mary. But fate, cruel and unyielding, had ripped her away in the cold grip of childbirth. She had fought with all her strength, her final cries echoing faintly through the wooden walls of their modest home. And then she was gone, leaving Thomas alone with a tiny, fragile life he had so little experience in caring for. The baby's cries pierced the silent ranch house like a relentless storm, and Thomas's heart ached with both grief and helplessness. He stared at the small bundle swaddled in blankets on the bed, his trembling hands hovering over the infant as though mere touch could shield him from the cruel reality that had befallen them. The child's tiny face, pink and delicate, with a mouth that opened again and again in search of sustenance, was the only tether Thomas had left to Mary, yet. He quickly realized that love alone could not satisfy the child's needs. He had never changed a diaper before, had never soothed a wailing baby, and most of all, he had never had to feed one without a mother to provide the milk that was essential for survival. Panic began to gnaw at him. He had no experience with infants, and the very thought that this little life could slip away if he failed was unbearable. His mind raced through the few options he could think of: cow's milk from the ranch, powdered milk from the distant town. Whatever might be safe enough for the baby's delicate system, but each idea seemed fraught with danger. The nearest neighbor who could provide help lived miles away, and the harsh winter was just beginning to make the journey treacherous. Thomas felt the isolation of the ranch more acutely than ever. The land that had once offered freedom and pride now seemed like a cage that separated him from the help he desperately needed. Night fell, bringing with it a cold that seeped through the walls of the house. Thomas wrapped himself in a heavy blanket, the baby cradled in his arms, and rocked back and forth, attempting to soothe both the child and his own shattered spirit. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the soot and sweat of hard ranch labor as he whispered words of comfort to Mary's child, promising that he would do everything in his power to keep this tiny life alive. But the responsibility felt almost unbearable. He longed for the warmth of Mary, her gentle voice guiding him through these uncharted waters, her touch reassuring the baby that the world was safe. As the hours dragged on, Thomas realized he had to set aside his grief to survive. The baby's hunger was immediate and relentless, a stark reminder that the clock was ticking. He knew he had to find a solution, and fast, or the consequences could be fatal. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, each second a reminder that a father's love, no matter how fierce, could not replace what the baby's mother had provided. The tragedy of loss intertwined with the urgency of survival created a whirlwind of fear, determination, and sorrow, setting the stage for the trials that were about to test his resilience in ways he had never imagined. Morning broke over the ranch with a crisp chill in the air, and Thomas McAllister rose from a restless night, his body aching and his heart heavy. The cries of his newborn had been relentless, and sleep had been nothing more than a fleeting shadow. The immediate realization hit him again: the baby needed milk, and there was none to be found. Panic, tempered only slightly by grim determination, coursed through him. He had to find a solution, no matter the effort, no matter the embarrassment, no matter the judgment of others. The first thought that came to his mind was the ranch itself. Perhaps cow's milk could serve as a temporary substitute. Thomas trudged through the frosty barn, the low morning sun glinting off the dew-covered fences, and tended to the cows. He milked a few, the rhythmic pull of the pail familiar from years of ranch labor. But as he examined the creamy liquid, a knot of worry formed in his stomach. He had heard stories of infants reacting poorly to cow's milk, of stomachs too delicate for the richness of it. Could he risk it? Each moment he hesitated felt like the child's life hung in the balance. Desperation pressed him forward, yet he could not shake the fear of doing irreparable harm. Failing the barn, he ventured into town, carrying the baby swaddled tightly against his chest. The roads were muddy from last night's rain, and every step was a struggle. At the general store, he asked for powdered milk, formula, anything suitable for a newborn. The storekeeper gave him a pitying look, explaining that the last supplies had been bought weeks ago and that they would not be restocked until next week. Thomas clenched his fists, the helplessness of the moment gnawing at him. Each minute he spent seeking sustenance was a minute the baby cried and weakened. He thanked the man quietly, the polite words bitter against the rising tide of anxiety, and turned back toward the ranch, defeated but unbroken. On the way home, Thomas visited a few neighbors, hoping that someone might have advice or even a small reserve of milk. He knocked on doors and found faces sympathetic yet helpless, each offering only words of comfort or suggestions that he already knew. Some suggested wet nurses, a practice that seemed almost archaic, yet desperation made it appear plausible. Others gave him tips on using cow's milk, adding small doses of water to make it gentler. But none could promise safety or success, and the weight of responsibility grew heavier on his shoulders. The baby's cries seemed louder with each failed attempt, echoing the mounting terror in Thomas's mind. Returning home, Thomas tried the cow's milk cautiously, feeding the baby only a few drops at a time. The infant's tiny stomach reacted unpredictably, bringing bouts of coughing and discomfort. Thomas's heart lurched with every spasm and whimper. The ranch, which had once been a place of solace and mastery, now felt like a vast, indifferent wilderness. He realized, with a pang of grief, that survival was no longer guaranteed by land, livestock, or hard work. It rested on knowledge he did not possess, and a resource he could not produce. A mother's milk dot by nightfall, exhaustion set in. Thomas cradled his newborn, rocking the baby as he rocked himself, the baby's cries muffled against his chest. He whispered promises he could scarcely keep, that he would find a way, that no harm would come, that they would survive this storm together. His grief, raw and unrelenting, mingled with a simmering determination. He would not allow despair to claim them. He realized he needed help, and that help could come from outside the safety of his pride or comfort zone. A plan began to form, hazy and uncertain, that would eventually lead him to a solution he had not yet dared imagine. The desperate search had only just begun. Each failed attempt, each rejection or obstacle, was a reminder of both the fragility of the newborn and the isolation Thomas faced. But deep within him, a stubborn ember of hope persisted. Somewhere, somehow, there was a way to save his child, and he would find it. The next knock at the door, the next word from a neighbor, could hold the answer, and Thomas was ready to confront whatever came. The following morning dawned with a pale, fragile light that barely penetrated the dusty windows of Thomas McAllister's ranch house. The baby's cries had not ceased. They were a constant, urgent reminder of his failure to provide what was most essential. Thomas sat by the small hearth, his shoulders slumped, hands trembling as he rocked the infant back and forth. The desperation that had driven him to scour the town, knock on neighbor doors, and attempt cow's milk in small doses had brought him nothing but temporary relief and mounting fear. It seemed as though the ranch, so vast and empty, had no answers for him. And yet, just as hopelessness began to settle like a thick fog over his heart, there came a soft, tentative knock at the door. Thomas hesitated, a flicker of curiosity and anxiety passing over him. Who could possibly visit at this hour? Visitors were rare, and the townsfolk knew the rancher's reputation for stoicism and self-reliance. With a heavy sigh, he lifted the latch and opened the door, revealing a young girl standing on the threshold. She was modestly dressed in a simple dress, her apron tied neatly at the waist, her hands folded nervously in front of her. Her eyes, large and steady, held a mixture of shyness and quiet determination. She was a neighbor, a girl Thomas had known for years, though they had rarely spoken outside of polite greetings. "Mr. McAllister," she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the wind that swept across the ranch. I heard about your baby. I thought maybe I could help." Thomas blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He opened his mouth, ready to offer polite but dismissive thanks to send her away, to remind himself that help could not come from neighbors for something so intimate and personal. But something in her gaze held him, a quiet courage that demanded attention. She was not imposing, nor was she seeking reward or recognition. She simply stood there, offering herself as a bridge over the impossible gap between despair and hope. "I don't know if it's appropriate," Thomas began cautiously, his voice rough with emotion, "but thank you for wanting to help. I'm afraid. I don't know what can be done. I've tried everything." The girl nodded as though she had expected the hesitation. "I know. I can't fix everything," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But maybe I can help in the way that matters most." Her words hung in the air, loaded with meaning, though she did not elaborate. Thomas felt a pang of both relief and unease. He was desperate, yes, but the solution she hinted at was unspoken, untested, and undoubtedly controversial. His pride, so tightly wound around his identity as a man and a widower, bristled at the thought of accepting such intimate aid. Yet the baby's cries rose again, piercing and insistent, and Thomas felt the truth that he had been avoiding. If the child went hungry, nothing else would matter. He studied the girl for a long moment. Her eyes reflected nothing but concern and sincerity. The rest of the world, the whispers of neighbors, the judgment of the town, the rigid rules of propriety faded in importance. This girl, whom he had known only peripherally, had come to offer a lifeline. And now he faced a choice that no father ever wishes to confront: pride or survival. Finally, with a heavy exhale, Thomas nodded. If you can help," he said cautiously, "I will not refuse. My child needs you." A faint smile touched her lips, and she stepped forward, the tension in her posture easing slightly. The first hesitant step toward trust had been taken. In that moment, the ranch seemed smaller, warmer, less unforgiving. Thomas still carried the weight of grief and fear, but alongside it now was a fragile glimmer of hope. Someone had answered the desperate call that he could not put into words: a human. Compassionate presence willing to intervene where circumstance and nature had failed. The neighbor girl's appearance marked the beginning of a turning point. She was not a savior in the grand, heroic sense, but her arrival planted the seed of possibility. Together, they would face judgment, struggle, and the challenges of nurturing new life, but for the first time in days, Thomas felt a measure of relief and a sense that the impossible might yet be overcome. The baby's cries, though still urgent, were no longer a reminder of inevitable failure. They were a call to action, answered by the unexpected courage of a neighbor who dared to step forward. The sun had climbed higher over the ranch, but its warmth did little to ease the tension that hung in the small house. Thomas McAllister sat at the edge of the rough-hewn wooden table, the baby swaddled loosely in his arms, eyes wide and searching. The neighbor girl, Emily, remained standing near the doorway, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. Her arrival yesterday had already eased some of the immediate tension of the previous night, but now a heavier, more complicated concern pressed down upon them both. Thomas had watched her carefully, noting her composure, her gentleness with the infant, and the quiet competence with which she moved. She had soothed the child, offered advice on warmth and cleanliness, and quietly shared stories of her own younger siblings. And yet, the persistent worry in her eyes betrayed a deeper intention she had not yet voiced. Thomas sensed it, but pride and shock had made him hesitate to ask directly. Now, as the baby whimpered again, Emily took a slow step forward. As if steeling herself for the weight of what she was about to say, "Mr. McAllister," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this might seem strange or even improper, but I think I might be able to help the baby in a way that no other solution could." She paused, swallowing quickly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Thomas's brow furrowed, unease creeping into his chest. The townsfolk had spoken often of propriety, and he had been raised with a rigid sense of what was acceptable. Yet desperation clawed at him, urging him to listen. Emily continued, her voice trembling slightly but carrying an undercurrent of courage. I can feed him. With my milk." The words hung in the air like a delicate, fragile thread, and for a moment Thomas could not speak. His mind whirled in disbelief. Could this really be possible? Could a neighbor, a young girl who had known him only casually, offer something so intimate, so vital, to save his child? The silence stretched, and Thomas felt a tug of conflicting emotions. Pride battled desperation, social expectation clashed with survival instinct, and grief mixed with the raw, unfiltered fear of losing the only thing left of Mary. He thought of the baby's tiny hands, the fragile curve of its neck, the soft, pitiful cries. The image seared itself into his mind, and he knew if he refused, the risk to the child was too great. His pride, stubborn as it had been, began to yield to necessity. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "This is unexpected, and it could cause talk in town. People, they'll judge. They'll call it improper." His gaze flicked to Emily's, searching for signs of doubt or malice. There was none. Only a quiet determination, tempered by empathy and understanding. She nodded, acknowledging his fears. "I know," she replied softly. "I know what people will say. I know it's unusual. But it's safe for the baby, and it's the only way I know to help him thrive. I can't replace his mother, but I can make sure he lives." Her honesty struck Thomas like a physical blow, piercing through his resistance. She was not imposing herself, nor asking for anything beyond the child's survival. She was offering life itself, and it rested entirely on his decision. Thomas took a deep breath, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Every instinct screamed caution. Every lesson of society warned him against acceptance. But the cries of the newborn overpowered all else. Slowly he nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Then, if you're willing, I will accept. My child must live." A quiet relief washed over Emily's face, and she stepped closer, carrying with her a calm and practical presence that seemed to fill the room. The moment was delicate and laden with unspoken understanding. Thomas's heart swelled, not with romantic thought yet, but with gratitude and the first sense of hope he had felt since Mary's passing. In that simple, courageous offer, the fragile beginnings of trust and cooperation were born, setting the stage for the unconventional path their lives would now follow. The morning sun slanted through the small windows of the McAllister ranch house, casting long, warm beams across the worn wooden floor. Thomas McAllister sat on a chair near the hearth, the newborn cradled carefully in his arms, while Emily stood beside him, her hands folded, her face a mixture of determination and nervousness. The moment of decision had passed. He had accepted her offer to feed the baby, and yet, now that it was here, the reality pressed down heavier than he had imagined. Thomas felt awkward and unsure. He had never experienced anything so intimate or vulnerable, and the thought of another person, especially a young woman from the neighboring homestead, caring for his child in such a personal way stirred an uncomfortable mixture of gratitude, guilt, and embarrassment. His pride bristled, but it was drowned out by the urgent need to ensure his child's survival. The baby whimpered, small fists curling and uncurling, and Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he shifted the child closer to Emily, who knelt down to the floor, easing the infant gently into her arms. Emily's movements were careful and deliberate. She had fed her younger siblings before, and while this situation was unusual, she treated it with quiet competence and respect. She spoke softly, coaxing the baby with gentle murmurs and subtle shifts of her body to make the infant comfortable. Thomas watched in tense silence, a mixture of fascination and fear gripping him. Each moment felt monumental. He felt like an intruder in a sacred space, yet he understood the gravity of the situation. His pride was still present, whispering that he should be the one to provide everything. But the cries of his newborn drowned out all but the need for survival. When the baby latched for the first time, a small gasp escaped Thomas's lips. Relief and wonder mingled in him. The infant's body, once tense and restless, relaxed against Emily's chest. Tiny fingers curled, eyes fluttered, and a soft, rhythmic suckling began. It was a simple, natural act, yet for Thomas it carried the weight of hope and life itself. The sound of the baby feeding was almost magical, a balm for the grief and desperation that had haunted the ranch for days. Still, Thomas could not relax completely. His heart thudded in his chest and awkwardness lingered like a shadow. He shuffled slightly, trying to give them privacy while remaining close enough to offer support if needed. Emily noticed, offering him a small, reassuring glance, acknowledging the tension but also signaling that there was no need for shame. Slowly, Thomas felt the first flickers of trust begin to settle between them. She had come not for recognition nor for comfort, but simply to help a life in peril. The baby fed steadily now, and Thomas felt an almost overwhelming wave of gratitude. Tears pricked his eyes, unbidden, and he swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. The thought of Mary, of what she would have done, how she would have comforted both him and the baby, mingled with the relief he felt. Emily, with quiet bravery, had stepped into a role that no one else could fill, and her courage and kindness left a deep impression on him. As the feeding continued, the ranch house seemed to breathe with them. The tension of the past days, the frantic search for milk, the nights of worry and fear began to ease, replaced by a tentative rhythm of hope. Thomas realized that, though this arrangement was unconventional, it had already begun to save his child. He allowed himself, cautiously, to feel a sense of gratitude that bordered on awe. By the time the baby finished feeding, falling into a peaceful sleep in Emily's arms, Thomas had changed. He was still wary, still conscious of the social implications, but he was no longer paralyzed by fear or pride. A fragile bond had been established, one built on trust, necessity, and human kindness. In that quiet room, the first step toward a new and unexpected chapter of their lives had begun, setting the stage for the emotional journey that lay ahead. Days turned into weeks, and life on the McAllister Ranch slowly settled into a fragile rhythm. The once overwhelming weight of grief and desperation had begun to ease, replaced by a cautious routine that centered on the newborn's needs. Thomas McAllister, still raw from the loss of his wife, had become accustomed to Emily's regular visits. At first, each arrival had carried a tension born of pride, uncertainty, and societal expectation, but gradually that tension began to soften. The ranch, which had seemed lonely and oppressive, now held a quiet warmth, brought not by the sun or the livestock, but by the presence of another human being who genuinely cared for the child and unexpectedly For him as well. Emily moved through the house with a quiet competence that made Thomas both relieved and envious. She had a natural ease with the baby that he could never hope to replicate. She soothed him when he cried, fed him when he was hungry, and shared little stories in soft, melodic tones that seemed to calm both father and child. Thomas began to watch her closely, noticing the gentleness of her hands, the patience in her voice, and the subtle ways she adjusted herself to make the infant comfortable. There was a grace to her that spoke of inner strength, a kind of quiet heroism that he could not help but admire. At first, Thomas's gratitude was mixed with awkwardness. Words often failed him, and he felt uncomfortably aware of how vulnerable he was in front of Emily, but she never judged, never pressed, and her warmth gradually eroded his hesitation. He began to share small details of his life memories of Mary, the routines of the ranch, the quiet struggles of maintaining the land through harsh seasons. Emily listened, offering empathy without intrusion, and in doing so, she built a bridge over the gap his grief had created. He began to feel a sense of relief he hadn't thought possible, the relief that comes from finding someone who understands, someone who carries no judgment, someone who simply helps without asking for anything in return. Their bond grew not only through necessity, but through the small, human moments that stitched their lives together. Thomas found himself looking forward to Emily's visits, noticing the warmth of her smile, the subtle humor she wove into her observations, and the patience with which she taught him small parenting skills. For the first time since Mary's passing, he laughed quietly at her teasing or the baby's antics, feeling a spark of life return to him. Each shared smile, each quiet conversation by the hearth, strengthened the trust that had been planted on that first desperate morning. Beyond the practical acts of care, Emily's presence began to touch Thomas in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself observing her silently, wondering about her day, her thoughts, her fears. A quiet curiosity replaced his earlier awkwardness. He began to see her not just as a neighbor or a helper, but as a person with her own strength, her own heart. This awareness was both thrilling and frightening, for it meant acknowledging a longing he had tried to suppress. Meanwhile, the baby thrived, growing stronger and more content each day. Thomas saw in his child's health and happiness the tangible proof of Emily's care and dedication. Gratitude turned into admiration, admiration into respect, and slowly, respect blossomed into an unspoken closeness. Words were not yet necessary. The trust between them was evident in shared glances, in the ease with which they moved together around the child, and in the quiet understanding that grew in the spaces between their words. By the end of these early weeks, the McAllister Ranch had begun to transform. It was no longer a place marked solely by loss and isolation. It had become a space of tentative hope, built on care, compassion, and the growing bond between a father, a baby, and the girl who had stepped into their lives when they needed her most. The foundation for something deeper: friendship, trust, perhaps even love, was quietly taking shape, rooted in shared hardship and mutual respect. The McAllister Ranch, once a quiet and isolated stretch of land, had become the center of subtle, yet persistent, attention in the surrounding community. Word travels fast in a small frontier town, and while few had direct contact with Thomas and his newborn, the unusual arrangement with Emily, the neighbor girl who had stepped in to feed the child, did not remain a secret for long. At first, the whispers were tentative, polite murmurs carried by those who came to trade goods or seek work from the ranch. But as days turned to weeks, the murmurings grew bolder, and Thomas could feel the weight of judgment pressing in from every direction. It began with passing glances at the general store, polite but loaded with suspicion. The storekeeper, who had once offered advice and small comforts, now watched him with a quiet, uncomfortable curiosity, glancing occasionally at Emily when she visited to check on the baby. Neighbors, while friendly in conversation, could not resist the subtle questions, the raised eyebrows, the undercurrents of speculation that hinted at impropriety. It was not malicious, exactly, but it carried the force of social expectation in a community where tradition held sway. Thomas, already sensitive from the loss of his wife and the struggles of keeping his newborn alive, felt the scrutiny acutely. He worried that the whispers would become overt criticism, that the kindness Emily had shown and which he had accepted out of necessity would be twisted into scandal in the eyes of others. Pride, long a guiding force in his life, bristled against the invisible pressures, and he found himself growing defensive, sometimes brusque, toward those who asked questions or lingered too long in conversation. Yet at the same time, he could not bring himself to regret what had been done. His child was alive, thriving, and more peaceful than ever since Emily's help had begun. Emily, too, felt the community's attention, though in a different way. Where Thomas bristled, she met it with quiet resilience. She had grown up helping her family, managing household responsibilities, and stepping into roles that required courage and discretion. She understood that the townsfolk might not approve, but she also understood the stakes. She did not seek approval or recognition. Her focus remained on the child's well-being. Yet even she could not escape the sting of judgment entirely. Small remarks, careful questions, and the occasional pointed look reminded her that societal norms were unforgiving, especially for a young woman acting outside traditional roles. Despite the scrutiny, something remarkable began to unfold. While some criticized or whispered, others were quietly impressed by the courage and practical kindness displayed. A few neighbors, especially those who had faced hardship themselves, recognized the necessity of Emily's actions and admired her willingness to help without expectation of reward. Slowly, the ranch became a quiet symbol, not only of the vulnerability of life but also of the courage it took to meet it head-on. Thomas and Emily developed a silent code between them in response to the outside world. They spoke little of judgment or whispers, focusing instead on their shared responsibility and the care of the child. Each glance, each subtle nod, each unspoken understanding reinforced their connection and strengthened their bond against the social pressure. In the face of rumor and skepticism, their teamwork became a protective force, shielding both the baby and their fragile trust. By the end of the first month, the community's reaction, though still present, had shifted in nuance. Some continued to judge, some whispered behind closed doors, but more began to recognize the undeniable truth. The child was healthy, happy, and thriving. Survival and compassion, in the eyes of many, outweighed conventional propriety. And for Thomas and Emily, this growing awareness of community sentiment only reinforced the quiet intimacy that had formed between them, a bond forged not just through necessity, but through shared courage, resilience, and commitment in the face of scrutiny. The challenges of public perception were far from over, but the first test had been met. The whispers, once sharp and threatening, became part of the background of life on the ranch, a reminder that the world would always watch, but that the bond they were building between father, child, and neighbor was stronger than rumor or judgment. Evenings on the McAllister Ranch had begun to take on a different character. The long days of labor, care, and quiet tension were giving way to moments of unexpected calm. The baby, now stronger and more content, slept more easily in Emily's arms or in the small cradle Thomas had built. The ranch house, which had once felt oppressive and hollow after Mary's death, now held a warm glow from the hearth, a sense of life and continuity that neither Thomas nor Emily had dared to hope for. It was in one of these quiet evenings, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and the sky bled gold and crimson, that emotions long suppressed began to surface. Thomas sat near the hearth, the baby swaddled and sleeping in a soft bundle beside him. Emily had just finished tidying the small room, her movements careful and unhurried. The silence was comfortable, yet heavy with things left unspoken. Thomas's mind wandered, as it often did these days, to the enormity of his loss and the gratitude he felt toward Emily. She had stepped into a role no one else could have filled. Her courage and care giving life and stability to the most vulnerable person in the world, their child. And yet, it was not only gratitude that stirred in him. He found himself noticing her more than he had before, the way her hands moved with quiet purpose, the gentle tones of her voice, the resilience and warmth that seemed to radiate from her. Emily, sensing the weight in the room, stopped her tasks and glanced at him, a question in her eyes. Thomas took a deep breath, unsure how to begin. Words had been failing him for days, and now the vulnerability of speaking them pressed against his pride like a physical weight. Emily, he began slowly, voice rough with emotion. I don't know how to say this properly, but I don't know what I would have done without you these past weeks. I don't think I could have managed. The baby and me. We owe you more than I can express. Emily's expression softened, and she shook her head slightly. You don't have to say that, Thomas, she replied gently. I'm glad I could help. I care about him. And I wanted to make sure he was safe. Her words were simple, yet they carried a depth that touched Thomas profoundly. He realized in that moment that her commitment had not been casual or fleeting, it had been a choice, repeated daily, made from compassion and strength. The pause that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Thomas felt a vulnerability he had not known since Mary's death, a mixture of grief, relief, and a hesitant hope. It's more than that, he admitted quietly. It's not just gratitude I feel. I felt so alone. And then you came, and now, I don't know how to explain it, but it's more than relief. I feel something more, something I haven't allowed myself to feel since Mary. Emily's eyes met his, a flicker of understanding and tenderness passing between them. Thomas, she said softly, I feel it too. I care for him, and I care about you. I didn't know it at first, but I do now. And I've worried that it might be wrong, or that you wouldn't feel the same. Her admission hung in the air, fragile and sincere, bridging the gap of uncertainty that had existed between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The baby stirred, then settled again, and the silence of the room felt intimate, protective, almost sacred. Thomas finally reached out, placing a tentative hand over hers, the first physical acknowledgement of the emotions they had both been holding back. Then, maybe. We don't have to be alone anymore, he whispered. Maybe, together, we can figure this out. A gentle smile curved Emily's lips, and she squeezed his hand in return. The emotional confession, though tentative and awkward, marked a turning point. They were no longer simply a father and a helper, no longer bound solely by necessity and duty. They were beginning to recognize a deeper connection, one forged in trust, shared vulnerability, and the courage to acknowledge feelings that had been long suppressed. That evening, the ranch seemed warmer, the hearth brighter, and the future uncertain as it was slightly less daunting. In that quiet space, Thomas and Emily discovered that even in the shadow of loss, new beginnings, compassion, and the possibility of love could emerge. The McAllister Ranch, usually a place of quiet rhythm and tentative hope, was suddenly thrown into chaos one late autumn afternoon. Dark clouds had gathered over the horizon, the wind picking up with an unusual intensity, and Thomas McAllister sensed danger before it arrived. The ranch, sprawling and open, offered little protection from the elements, and the livestock, usually calm and orderly, stamped anxiously in the corrals. Emily had been inside, tending to the baby, when Thomas's sharp calls alerted her that something was amiss. A sudden storm was approaching, faster and fiercer than either had anticipated. At first, they focused on immediate safety. Thomas rushed to secure the barn, tying down gates and moving feed and tools to prevent damage. Emily, with the baby swaddled tightly against her chest, worked quickly to reinforce the house and prepare warm blankets. The urgency of the moment left no room for hesitation or pride. Every second counted. Every action mattered. Together, they moved through the house and yard like a coordinated unit, their previous awkwardness and social hesitation replaced by practical efficiency and mutual reliance. The storm hit with a sudden ferocity. Rain lashed against the windows, and gusts of wind threatened to topple fences and send debris flying across the yard. The baby stirred nervously, and Emily held him close, murmuring softly to calm him while Thomas worked to secure the weakest parts of the house. In the face of the tempest, there was no room for fear or hesitation. The survival of both the child and the ranch depended on their solidarity. As the hours stretched on, they were forced to confront challenges that tested not only their physical endurance, but also their emotional resilience. A fallen tree blocked the path to the barn, trapping some of the livestock inside. The roof of the small shed began to leak, threatening to ruin essential supplies. Thomas, soaked and exhausted, realized he could not manage everything alone. Without a word of complaint, Emily stepped forward, her hands steady as she helped move the smaller animals to safety and reinforce the shed with the tools he had gathered. Her courage and competence under pressure reminded Thomas why he had trusted her from the start, and reinforced the bond they had begun to build over weeks of shared responsibility. Amid the storm, moments of vulnerability and support emerged. Thomas slipped on the slick wooden floor while securing the barn door, and Emily caught him, steadying both him and the heavy latch he had been struggling with. The gesture, simple yet profound, highlighted the trust and care that had grown between them. In that instant, Thomas recognized that their relationship had moved far beyond necessity. They were now a team, capable of relying on one another in ways that transcended words. By nightfall, the storm began to subside, leaving the ranch battered but intact. The baby slept peacefully, exhausted from the commotion, wrapped safely in Emily's arms. Thomas sank into a chair, drenched and weary, but filled with a profound sense of relief and gratitude. He looked at Emily, who was equally tired yet calm, and realized that the crisis had revealed something crucial. Their bond was strong enough to withstand external challenges, stronger even than the fears and judgments that had loomed over them before. In the quiet aftermath, as the rain dripped from the roof and the wind faded into distant echoes, they shared a moment of reflection. Words were minimal, but their shared glances, the unspoken acknowledgement of their teamwork, and the sense of mutual respect and care conveyed what neither had fully expressed before. They had survived together, protected the baby together, and in doing so, solidified the foundation of trust, reliance, and burgeoning affection. The crisis had tested their limits physically, emotionally, and socially, but it had also affirmed the path they were on. Through solidarity, courage, and mutual support, Thomas and Emily realized that whatever the world might say, they could face challenges together. And in that understanding, the bonds of family, love, and commitment were strengthened, preparing them for the final steps toward a future neither had dared to imagine when the storm first arrived. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered gently through the curtains of the McAllister ranch house, casting a warm glow across the modest room. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving the air crisp and fresh, the ground glistening with dew. Inside, a quiet sense of peace filled the space, an unusual but welcome presence after weeks of grief. desperation, and relentless struggle. Thomas McAllister sat in his chair, the baby cooing softly in a cradle beside him, and Emily moved about the room with an ease born of routine and care. The rhythm of life had returned, but it was a new rhythm, one shaped by shared responsibility, mutual respect, and the unexpected bonds that had grown between them. Thomas took a moment to observe the scene, allowing himself to appreciate how far they had come. The baby, once fragile and constantly in need, had grown stronger, feeding well and sleeping more peacefully. Emily's consistent care had nurtured the child in a way that no one else could, and in doing so, she had also brought life and warmth back to the ranch and to Thomas himself. He felt gratitude that ran deep and wide, mingling with a quiet sense of relief. The house, once so heavy with loss and silence, now felt alive with possibility. The days that followed the storm passed in a comfortable routine. The baby thrived under Emily's care and Thomas's watchful presence. They worked together seamlessly, whether tending the livestock, repairing fences, or preparing meals. What had begun as necessity had evolved into collaboration, and collaboration had blossomed into companionship. Shared glances, small jokes, and quiet conversations filled the spaces of the house, slowly weaving a fabric of trust and understanding between Thomas and Emily. Their bond had grown beyond gratitude and obligation. It was now threaded with affection and respect. Tempered by the trials they had faced together, one afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the distant hills, Thomas finally allowed himself to speak openly about the future. "Emily," he said gently, his voice tinged with both hope and vulnerability, "these past weeks, I don't know how I could have survived them without you. You've saved my child, yes, but you've also saved me, in a way I never thought possible." Emily looked at him, her expression soft, her eyes reflecting the same depth of feeling he sensed in himself. "I didn't do it for praise," she replied, her voice steady but warm. "I did it because it was right. And I care for you both. I've come to feel like this place, this family. It's where I belong." The words, simple yet profound, carried a weight of honesty that Thomas had been longing to hear. He reached for her hand, the first fully unguarded gesture of intimacy between them, and she responded with a gentle squeeze. In that moment, the fragile walls of grief, pride, and hesitation crumbled completely. The community, which had once whispered and watched with suspicion, began to accept the new reality of the McAllister household. While some still murmured, most saw the undeniable truth: a child thriving, a father no longer isolated, and a young woman whose courage and compassion had created a bond that could not be ignored. Slowly, respect replaced judgment, and their unconventional family began to find its place within the social fabric of the town. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable routine, but it was now imbued with hope and purpose. Thomas and Emily shared responsibilities, joys, and even the occasional sorrow as they nurtured the baby together. The house rang with laughter, conversation, and the soft cooes of a happy child. The bond between them, forged in desperation and strengthened through trials, had transformed into love not the sudden, dramatic kind of novels and songs, but a quiet, steadfast, enduring love built on trust, respect, and shared experience. By the end of the story, the McAllister Ranch had become more than a home. It had become a symbol of resilience, compassion, and new beginnings. Thomas, once weighed down by grief and fear, now stood strong not only as a father but as a partner, ready to face life's challenges alongside Emily. Together, they had turned loss into hope, fear into trust, and uncertainty into a future full of promise. The baby thrived, the community watched with admiration, and the once lonely ranch pulsed with life, love, and the quiet certainty that Even in the wake of tragedy, new beginnings were possible.